Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong said coordination between Seoul and Washington over an end-of-war declaration has been quite complete, while Daniel Crittenbrink, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, said it is difficult for him to make any prediction about the progress of the possible declaration. In the meantime, the United States co-sponsored the North Korean Human Rights Resolution submitted to the UN General Assembly's Third Committee, and it has yet to be seen whether South Korea will co-sponsor it. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell was the planner for the United Nations Command and the Combined Forces Command. Andrew Yao is also with me today. Dr. Yao is the chair in Korea Studies at Brookings Institution's Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's also a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in D.C. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
South Korea's Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong said coordination between South Korea and the United States has been quite complete over the end-of-war declaration. And during his visit to Seoul, Daniel Crittenbrink, Assistant Secretary of State, he said the discussion about the end-of-war declaration has been very productive, adding that the U.S. is willing to engage in the serious discussion over any issue raised by South Korea. Mr. Maxwell, does this sound to you that Seoul and Washington are aligned on this issue?
I think that the Secretary's statements and the Minister's statements illustrate just how strong our alliance is, that we consult, we coordinate, we discuss the issues. Now, whether there's going to be an end-of-war declaration is problematic. The Kim family regime has said that they would not agree to one without lifting of sanctions. And so it appears to be problematic.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, why would Chung Eui-yong say the discussion is quite complete?
Well, it may be complete, and they may have a plan forward on how to pursue an end-of-war declaration. That does not mean that it would be announced today. It may be that they have a plan to try to enter into negotiations with North Korea to discuss an end-of-war declaration. And what I think, I hope, is that they will have decided on what are the necessary conditions to announce an end-of-war declaration. And I would hope that those conditions include a reduction in the conventional forces along the DMZ that threaten Seoul. Without such a change in conditions, an end-of-war declaration continues to put South Korea at great risk to North Korea's artillery and offensive capabilities. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ya, did what Crittenbrink said sound like the discussion is quite complete, as Chung Eui-yong said?
Yes, yeah. I interpret the South Korean government's position or their statement to mean that the initial gap that existed between Seoul and Washington on the end-of-war declaration has narrowed, but that's different from saying that it's different from saying that they see eye to eye on the issue. It does mean that there's a healthy mutual understanding of where the other side is coming from in pushing ahead or delaying the declaration. The declaration obviously needs to be something both sides feel comfortable in making, but it shouldn't be offered in and of itself and divorced from the current political context. So I think the Assistant Secretary of State is alluding to that fact that perhaps the United States isn't quite at the place where the South Korean government is in making this end-of-war declaration.
Mm-hmm. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan earlier said the U.S. and South Korea may have somewhat different perspectives on the precise sequence or timing or conditions for different steps. Meanwhile, Chung said the United States is in agreement with South Korea on the need for this declaration and what form it should take, as well as its substance. Dr. Yeo, what should we make of all this?
Well, I mean, the statement that they made is diplomatic speak. Both Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Chung are messaging that they agree on the principles of diplomatic engagement with North Korea, but they disagree on tactics, particularly with timing. And I do feel that South Korea has put a lot of effort into pushing for this end of war declaration. These negotiations or discussions have been going on for, it seems like several weeks now. But I do feel that there's more to the alliance relationship, more to North Korea, discussing North Korean denuclearization than focusing on this one specific tactical point on the end of war declaration.
Mm-hmm. Chung Eui-yong admitted that the end of war declaration will not be easy. And he said it's not something that can be achieved only through an agreement between the US and South Korea. Mr. Maxwell, is he talking about North Korea?
I'm sure that he is, and perhaps China's as well. But I think what he is alluding to, and what I hope he is alluding to, and what I think would be the U.S. position is that there really should be no end of war declaration until there are negotiations. Until North Korea, South Korea, the United States agree on an end of war declaration, and as I said, establishing the proper conditions that ensure the security of the Republic of Korea. Instead, I think that if there's a unilateral alliance declaration of the end of the Korean War, that Kim Jong-un is going to interpret that as success for his political warfare strategy, his blackmail diplomacy, in which he's been masterful at getting something for nothing. And he uses provocations, increased tension, and threats to gain political and economic concessions. And this is a political concession that he will exploit to try to drive a wedge in the alliance and use to argue to get U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula, which is one of his key objectives.
Mm-hmm. Then what is the minimum prerequisites for the end of war declaration? I mean, to start the discussion with North Korea.
Well, I think that the U.S. and South Korea are willing to discuss it with no preconditions. So I think they would come to the table to discuss it. However, to conclude it, I would call for a removal of the artillery from the Quezon Heights, a withdrawal of the frontline armor and mechanized infantry at least 20 kilometers north of the DMZ, preferably about 40 kilometers north of the DMZ. You have to understand that North Korean forces are postured for offensive operations. South Korean forces are postured for the defense. And so there's very different military calculus here. And so it will be necessary for North Korea to demonstrate the right confidence building measures and that it has no hostile intent. And I think that's what is really key here. Everybody focuses on the alliance hostile intent, but no one discusses North Korea's hostile intent. And I believe that its strategy of 70 years to dominate the Korean Peninsula has never changed. And until we see evidence of that, we should not put South Korea at risk from a potential North Korean attack.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Yeo, what should be done? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just follow on from David's comment. And David focused on the reduction of conventional forces, conventional weapons. I agree with David that I do think that the United States can discuss the end of war declaration. It's different to conclude it. And I don't think there's necessarily a list of prerequisites that need to be checked before making the end of war declaration. But in addition to the conventional force reductions that David mentioned, at the most basic level, the South Korean and the US government need to know whether and how North Korea will respond to this declaration. It makes little sense to declare the end of war if Pyongyang continues to expand its nuclear program or fire missiles. The US has stated that it wants to see North Korea take steps towards denuclearization before considering an end of war declaration. And ideally, this includes the declaration of existing nuclear sites. So in addition to the conventional reductions that David mentioned, I would say regardless of what specific prerequisites are there, an end of war declaration needs to be part of a broader step-by-step process and not just offered with the hope that Kim Jong-un would change his attitude towards dialogue.
Right. Dr. Yeo, do you see any possibility that they could start this discussion with North Korea?
The discussion about an end of war declaration?
Anytime soon?
I mean, the U.S. U.S. interlocutors, they've said repeatedly, we're ready to meet North Koreans at any time, any place. And that could include discussions about an end of war declaration. But as we, both David and I have argued, you can have a discussion about the end of war declaration, what that might mean or what that could mean. And we do want to know how North Korea would interpret it. So it could even make sense to have some kind of discussion, but to conclude that at this stage may be premature.
Right. So starting the discussion of an end of war declaration is one thing, and concluding the discussion is totally different thing. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, we really have to really make a substantive agreement to make an end of war declaration to be meaningful and again, to ensure security. I think that's what we have to keep foremost in our mind is the security of the Republic of Korea. We are very complacent because for 70 years, the armistice and the ROK-US combined military forces have deterred North Korea, and there has been no resumption of hostilities. And we should not be complacent that North Korea will not attack. As Sun Tzu said, never assume your enemy will not attack, make yourself invincible.
And now we'll move on to a different topic. The US has co-sponsored the EU drafted resolution on the situation of human rights in North Korea at the UN General Assembly Third Committee. Why is this important for the US to participate in this resolution as a co-sponsor?
I think the Biden administration and really any administration needs to take a human rights upfront approach when dealing with our adversaries. Human rights is not only a moral imperative, it's a national security issue. In particular, North Korea, Kim Jong-un must deny the human rights of the Korean people in order to remain in power. And of course, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry in 2014 assessed that North Korea's human rights abuses and crimes against humanity are on a scale we haven't seen since World War II. So the amount of suffering in North Korea is just horrendous, and it is all at the hands of Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime. And so it's important that we focus on human rights, even as we want to denuclearize. And we should take a lesson from President Reagan when he negotiated nuclear reductions with the Soviet Union. While those talks were going on, he never hesitated to call out the Soviet Union for its human rights abuses against the Russian people.
And Dr. Yeo?
So in terms of why it's important for the U.S. to participate in this resolution, the U.S. and especially the Biden administration is trying to promote, a values-based diplomacy. There's a democracy summit that's coming up in December, and to not address North Korean human rights would make the U.S. look hypocritical. So they do need to address North Korean human rights. And I know there was this question about why the U.S. The U.S. has co-sponsored this resolution every year, and we have to remember that the North Korean human rights movement has a long history in the United States with involvement from both civil society groups such as the North Korea Freedom Coalition and parts of the U.S. government, including U.S. Congress. The U.S. was the first country to pass a North Korean Human Rights Act back in 2004, so it should come as no surprise that the U.S. would co-sponsor a resolution on North Korean human rights at the UN General Assembly annually. So it's good to see that the U.S. has continued this tradition of co-sponsoring, signing on to this resolution each year.
This year's resolution was especially meaningful as it was the first of its kind to include the human rights situation of South Korean POWs in North Korea. Mr. Maxwell, could you tell us why it was important to talk about South Korean POWs?
Yes, it has been too long forgotten and overlooked that some 78,000 South Korean soldiers who were prisoners of war remained in North Korea, were not repatriated when the armistice was signed. And these South Korean soldiers have suffered horrendously in the last 7 decades. While they ended up being integrated into North Korean society, they were given the lowest class of songbun, the social classification system. And they have really labored to their death in the mines and, under hard labor. Although they were allowed to marry often and develop families in the North, their families were also subject to the same level of songbun and the lowest class of society with no opportunity to live a good life. And so it is important that we recognize the sacrifice that they made for freedom in South Korea, how they have suffered, and they need to have the respect and recognition that they were held prisoner. There may be some still alive. About 100 or so have escaped over the years, but we also need to think about the legacy of their families in the South, as well as their families in the North that are still suffering because of the system in North Korea.
Dr. Yeo, have the UN resolutions actually brought some changes in North Korea?
on the broader question of whether UN resolutions actually have any impact on North Korea, I would say yes, but not necessarily in a direct way and very incrementally. Even if critics state that the UN resolutions are just words on a piece of paper, it's important to know that the UN General Assembly puts on record the ongoing rights violations taking place in North Korea, because it's about accountability. Now, North Korea, they actually do react to condemnation at the United Nations. What would be far worse is if the regime said nothing and simply ignored resolutions and investigations like the Commission of Inquiry that was conducted in 2014. Denial is part of a long-term process in pushing rights-abusing states to slowly shift behavior. So even though we don't see a lot of movement or shift in North Korean behavior on the human rights front, the resolutions are still important. And there has been very small incremental movements. For instance, North Koreans signing on to the rights of people with disabilities. So it's not that they're completely immune to resolutions or criticism. So even if people say that, well, the UN process is not moving fast enough, or it's really not that effective, and on that front, I would disagree that there are, at the very least, indirect ways where these UN resolutions and statements do have some sort of impact.
Right.
The other point to add on to Andrew about the value of the resolutions. Again, the Commission of Inquiry noted that the people in North Korea do not really understand that their human rights are being violated and abused. And so these actions help to inform the Korean people in the North. And also, as North Korean escapees will tell us, it gives them hope that the outside world cares. I think it's really clear that South Korea, the United States, and the international community cares more about the welfare of the Korean people in the North than does Kim Jong-un. If he cared about them, then he would prioritize their welfare over the nuclear program. And he would also accept the humanitarian assistance that has been offered to help them. Lastly, when we focus on the nuclear program and the nuclear threats, we enhance the regime's legitimacy. But when we focus on human rights, it undermines the legitimacy of the regime, and it puts pressure on him.
North Korea, as expected, criticized a resolution saying the regime is putting its people first. Dr. Yeo, what do you think about what they're saying?
Yeah, well, I'm not really sure what it means by putting the people first, if it means starving the country. But it's clear that there's a humanitarian crisis in North Korea right now. There's a health crisis and there's a food shortage crisis. And of course, part of it has to do with the very strict pandemic border lockdowns that the North Koreans imposed. This has been going on for almost 2 years now, and there have been opportunities for North Korea to respond differently. There was offers for AstraZeneca vaccines in June, which were rejected, and then of course 3 million doses of Sinovac vaccines procured through COVAX that was supposed to go to North Korea, and the North Koreans basically said thanks, but no thanks, send it somewhere else where there's more need. And without a vaccine strategy, it's going to be very difficult to open up the borders. But for whatever reason, North Korea has been very reluctant to take a different strategy. So I'm not sure if that really is putting the people first. I think what the regime doing is putting its own survival first, and it's used the pandemic as a way to help tighten control, to rein in markets. We've also heard that the regime is pushing back on ideological control. There's more ideological measures that are in place, cracking down on foreign information, foreign culture coming in. And so in some ways, the lockdown has been a boon for the regime to try to take control of the country. So it's really putting itself first and not the people.
And my last question for today. It seems like South Korea so far has not put its name as a co-sponsor of the resolution. If this is finalized, it'll be 3 years in a row that South Korea has not co-sponsored this resolution. Dr. Yeo, why is South Korea so reluctant?
I think the reluctance stems from the Moon government's belief that criticizing North Korea for human rights abuses will only further alienate North Korea and hinder inter-Korea engagement. As we heard Unification Minister Lee In-young state recently, criticizing North Korea is not the only means of addressing North Korean human rights, and that trying to peacefully engage with North Korea and address humanitarian concerns may be a more effective route to promoting rights. Now, that may be true, but co-sponsoring a resolution on North Korean human rights is not going to be the deciding factor in determining whether North Korea decides to engage or not. If North Korea wants something, it will negotiate. And we can just take an example during the Bush administration era where there was heavy criticism from the Bush government on North Korean human rights. I mean, this is when they passed the North Korean Human Rights Act, but it didn't stop North Korea from participating in the six-party talks. And even during the Trump administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, President Trump was very vocal on human rights because of the death of Otto Warmbier. But that didn't stop a year later from Kim Jong-un coming out of his shell and even meeting President Trump face to face. So just because you criticize or condemn North Korean human rights doesn't mean that it's going to stop the engagement process. North Koreans, if they want something, are going to come out to talk.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Maxwell?
I would just sum it up this way, that it is really a bad assumption to believe that by avoiding human rights, that it will lead to positive negotiations. I think that myth needs to be debunked, and that you can approach denuclearization and while not sacrificing human rights at the same time. And of course, we need to keep our values and our principles in mind, as well as the suffering of the Korean people in the North. Those are the ones that we really need to think about because they are suffering at the hands of the most despotic regime in the world, the Kim family regime and Kim Jong-un.
Right. Meanwhile, a number of news outlets are reporting there are some signs that North Korea and China are moving toward normalizing their trade. At the same time, resurgence of the coronavirus is being reported at border towns on the Chinese side. And as the winter is coming, we'll have to watch how this will affect normalizing the trade between North Korea and China. Mr. Maxwell and Dr. Yeo, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us here.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.